Picture this: a quiet room bathed in the dim flicker of a single bulb, the kind that buzzes faintly like a dying insect. The air is thick, heavy with the scent of dust, and something sour you can't quite place, something that clings to the back of your throat. In the corner, there's a shape. Small. Still. A doll, its glass eyes catching the light, glinting like they're alive. You tell yourself it's just a toy, a forgotten relic of childhood. But then the bulb flickers again, and in that split second of darkness, you swear it moved. Just an inch. Just enough to make your heart lurch into your chest. You blink, and it's back where it was. Or is it? The shadows stretch longer now, curling toward you like fingers, and that faint buzzing grows into a whisper you can't ignore. It's not the light. It's her. She's awake. Welcome, brave souls, to Dolls of the Damned, a descent into the blackest corners of the human psyche, where innocence twists into something unspeakable. Tonight, I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to peel back the skin of reality and show you the rot beneath. 3 true stories of dolls possessed by forces so vile, so relentless, they'll claw their way into your nightmares and nest there. These aren't fairy tales. These are accounts ripped from the trembling hands of those who lived them, or didn't. In America, we fear the dark, the unknown, the things that watch us when we think we're alone. And nothing embodies that dread quite like a doll. Those hollow-eyed mimics of life that sit silently, waiting. Waiting for what? You'll find out. First, we'll meet Annabelle, a ragdoll turned vessel for a demon's hunger, her stitched smile hiding a thirst for blood. Then, there's Robert, a straw-stuffed terror whose jealousy drowns a family in madness and gore. And finally, Mandy, a porcelain beauty whose cracked face mirrors the fractured minds of those who dared to own her. These stories will sink into you, festering like an open wound. You'll feel the cold of their glass stares, the weight of their malice pressing down on your chest. And when it's over, I want to hear from you. Drop your fears in the comments. Let me know what keeps you awake after this. Because trust me, you won't sleep soundly tonight. The dolls are listening. Let's begin. Story 1. Annabelle, the Ragdoll Reaper. The air in Donna Reese's apartment was always stale. A faint whiff of mildew baked into the walls of the gray clapboard building she called home in Hartford, Connecticut. It was 1970, a year of bell-bottoms and Nixon on the radio, and Donna, at 28, was a nursing student who spent her days elbow-deep in the antiseptic haze of the hospital and her nights hunched over textbooks, her eyes burning from the glare of a single desk lamp. She shared the place with Angie Morales, a wiry girl with a smoker's rasp and a habit of leaving coffee cups half full on every surface. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a chipped Formica counter, and a living room where a sagging couch faced a TV that flickered more than it played. It was ordinary, painfully so, until the doll arrived. It came in a crinkle of butcher paper, handed over by Donna's mother during a Sunday visit, her hands trembling slightly as she passed it off like it was something she'd been itching to shed. A Raggedy Ann doll, its red yarn hair tangled and thinning, its blue dress faded to a muddy gray, its button eyes matte and lifeless, or so Donna thought. She unwrapped it with a laugh, the kind that catches in your throat when something feels off, but you can't name it. "I had one like this as a kid," she said, though the memory didn't come. Her mother just nodded, her lips tight, and left without another word. Donna tossed the doll onto the couch, its floppy limbs sprawling across the cushions, and forgot about it. For a while, the first night, nothing happened. The doll lay there, a lump of cloth and stuffing, its stitched smile curling up at the corners like it knew something Donna didn't. She walked past it on her way to bed, the floorboards creaking under her bare feet, and felt a prickle on her neck, sharp, like a pin dragging across skin. She rubbed it away, blaming the draft from the cracked window, and slept with the heavy, dreamless exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. But the next morning, Angie was in the kitchen, her cigarette dangling as she stared at the couch. "Did you move that thing?" she asked, her voice flat. Donna frowned. The doll was sitting up now, its back pressed against the armrest, its head tilted toward the door. Its yarn hair spilled over one button eye, giving it a lopsided, watchful look. "No," Donna said, her stomach tightening. "Must have fallen that way." Angie shrugged, but her fingers lingered on the counter, tapping out a rhythm she didn't seem to notice. That was the beginning. The doll didn't stay still after that. It moved in increments, small enough to doubt, big enough to dread. One night, Donna came home late, her scrubs clinging to her from a shift spent mopping vomit off the ER floor, and found it perched on the kitchen table. Its cloth hands rested on the edge, palms up, and a streak of red smeared across one finger. Ketchup, she told herself, though the bottle in the fridge was sealed tight, its cap crusted with age. She wiped it off with a paper towel, her skin crawling as the damp fabric grazed her knuckles, and tossed the towel in the trash. The next morning, the trash was overturned, the towel gone, and a faint red stain bloomed on the linoleum like a bruise under skin. The air changed after that. It thickened, grew sour, a metallic tang that coated Donna's tongue every time she breathed, like she'd licked a handful of pennies left out in the rain. She started waking up with her sheets twisted around her legs, her dreams jagged fragments of a little girl with no face, her voice a hiss of static that scratched at the inside of Donna's skull. "Let me stay," it whispered, over and over, until she jolted awake, her mouth dry and tasting of rust. Angie noticed it too, the air, the unease. She stopped smoking inside, said it made the smell worse, and started sleeping with a knife under her pillow, though she wouldn't say why. The doll watched it all, its button eyes catching the light in flickers, glinting like wet glass. A week later, the movements stopped being subtle. Donna found it in her bedroom one night, sprawled across her bed, its yarn hair fanned out on her pillow like a blood-red halo. The sheets were damp, streaked with something dark that smelled of copper and rot. She yanked it off, her hands shaking, and threw it into the living room, where it landed with a soft thud, its limbs splaying out in a mockery of surrender. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did Angie. They sat on the couch, the doll at their feet, and listened to the silence stretch tight, waiting for something to snap. Outside, the neighbor's dog, a mangy mutt that barked at shadows, started up, its yips sharp and frantic. Then it stopped. The next morning, Donna found a tuft of fur on the stoop, matted with blood, and a smear of red trailing into the grass. The doll was on the windowsill when she came back inside, facing out, its stitched mouth seeming to widen. The note started soon after, scribbled on scraps, receipts, napkins, the corner of a textbook page, always in the same jagged scrawl, the ink thick and red. "Help us," they said, over and over, the letters bleeding into the paper like they'd been scratched in with a nail. Angie found the first one under her coffee mug, the words smeared where the heat had melted the ink. Donna found another in her scrub's pocket, the fabric stiff with dried crimson. They burned them in the sink, the flames licking up the paper as the room filled with a stench like singed hair and sulfur. But the notes kept coming, appearing in places they couldn't explain, tucked into the fridge, wedged under a door, stuck to the bathroom mirror with a clod of something wet and brown. The doll's presence grew heavier, a weight that pressed on their chests, their minds. Donna's arms started to itch, then burn, until one morning she woke to scratches, 3 parallel lines carved into her forearm, deep enough to weep blood onto her sheets. She stared at them, her breath shallow, as the cuts pulsed with a heat that spread up her arm, into her skull. Angie found her cat next, a tabby named Midge, gutted in the bathtub. Its belly was split open, its entrails coiled around the drain like a nest, the water pink and swirling. The doll sat on the sink, a kitchen knife clutched in its cloth fist, the blade crusted with blood that dripped onto the tile, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. Flies came after that, a buzzing cloud that filled the apartment, their wings a drone that drowned out every other sound. Donna swatted at them, her hands slick with sweat and something thicker, and felt their bodies burst against her skin, leaving smears of black and red. They called a medium, a woman named Clara with trembling hands and eyes like clouded marbles, her hair a tangle of gray that hung over her face like a shroud. She came on a Thursday, the sky outside bruised with storm clouds, and sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the doll in her lap. Its button eyes stared up at her, unblinking, as she traced its stitched mouth with a finger that shook so badly it left a smear of sweat on the fabric. "There's a spirit here," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "A girl, Annabelle Higgins, died at 7, right where this building stands. Hit by a car. She wants to stay. She's lonely." Clara's hands tightened on the doll, her knuckles whitening, and for a moment, the air stilled, the buzzing stopped. Then the doll's head twitched, just an inch, and Clara gasped, dropping it like it had burned her. "She's not alone," she said, scrambling back, her eyes wide and wet. "There's something else." That night, the apartment erupted. Donna woke to a sound like fingernails dragging down the walls, slow and deliberate, the wood splintering under the pressure. She stumbled into the living room, her bare feet sticking to the floor where something wet had pooled, and saw the doll standing by the couch, its cloth legs stiff, its arms bent at angles cloth shouldn't bend. The scratches on her arms reopened, blood trickling down her wrists, and the air filled with that static hiss again, louder now, screaming "let me stay" until her ears rang. Angie burst in, her knife in hand, and froze as the doll's head snapped toward her, its button eyes glinting red in the dark. The flies returned, a swarm that blackened the room, their bodies slamming into the walls, the windows, leaving streaks of gore that dripped like tears. The doll moved then, a jerky stumble forward, the knife from the bathroom clutched in its fist, its blade scraping the floor with a sound like bone on stone. They fled, barefoot and screaming, to a neighbor's apartment, pounding on the door until an old man let them in, his face pale as he muttered about the devil. The police came, then a priest, then another, until Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived, demonologists with faces carved from years of staring into the abyss. Ed was broad, his jaw set like granite, his eyes shadowed under a fedora. Lorraine was smaller, her hair a neat bob, her hands clasped around a rosary that clicked softly as she moved. They stood over the doll, now slumped on the floor where it had fallen, its knife embedded in the wood beside it. "This isn't a child," Ed said, his voice low and rough. "It's a demon. Use the girl's story to get in. It wants their souls." Lorraine nodded, her lips pressed thin, and traced a cross in the air, her fingers trembling as the doll's head twitched again, its stitched mouth curling wider. The Warrens took it, sealing it in a glass case lined with holy water and salt, the edges etched with prayers in Latin that smoked faintly as they were carved. But the journey home was a descent into hell. Their car swerved on the highway, the brakes squealing then failing as the air filled with laughter, a high, jagged cackle that clawed at their ears, coming from the trunk where the doll lay wrapped in a shroud. Ed clutched a crucifix, chanting prayers until his voice cracked, his knuckles bleeding where he gripped the wood too hard. Lorraine stared at the rearview mirror, where the doll's reflection grinned, its yarn hair writhing like worms, its button eyes glowing red through the glass. The car shuddered, the engine coughing black smoke, until they pulled over, Ed splashing holy water on the trunk while Lorraine whispered to the air, her breath fogging despite the summer heat. They locked it away in their occult museum in Monroe, Connecticut, behind a sign that read "Do Not Touch," the case bolted to the floor with steel rods. But the scratches didn't stop. Visitors bled without cause, their skin splitting in threes, forearms, necks, chests, leaving trails of blood that pooled on the floor, thick and clotting. A man who laughed at the doll, a burly guy with a trucker's cap, collapsed 3 days later in his driveway, his chest carved open from the inside, his heart gone, the asphalt around him stained with a pattern of 3 parallel lines. A woman who touched the case through a crack in the seal woke to find her toddler's crib empty, the sheets soaked red, the child's body found later in the yard, its throat slit in threes. Annabelle sits there still, in her case, her yarn hair matted with something dark that isn't dye, her button eyes dull until the light hits them just right. The Warrens are gone now, Ed's heart giving out in 2006, Lorraine following in 2019, but the doll remains, a quiet predator behind glass. Some say the scratches stopped, that the museum is safe now, a tourist trap for the curious. Others say they've just moved on, to new hands that brush too close, new homes that take her in, new flesh to mark with her signature of 3. The air around her hums faintly, a buzz like flies or a dying bulb, and if you listen long enough, you might hear it, a static hiss, a child's voice, pleading to stay, or something deeper, hungrier, laughing as it waits. Story 2. Robert, the Straw-Filled Sovereign. The air in Key West, Florida, in 1906 was a living thing, thick, wet, and heavy with the salt of the Gulf and the rot of mangrove swamps. It clung to the skin like a second layer, seeping into the cracks of the Otto family's Victorian home on Eaton Street, a narrow, 2-story relic of clabbered and peeling paint. The house stood crooked, its porch sagging under the weight of years, its windows clouded with salt spray that turned the glass into a cataract blur. Inside, the floors creaked with every step, the wood swollen from humidity, and the walls bore faint stains, brownish blooms that might have been mold or something older, something that wept through the plaster when the storms came. This was where Robert Eugene Otto, a boy of 6 with pale skin and eyes too wide for his face, first met the doll that would bear his name. It arrived on a muggy October afternoon, delivered not by a store clerk or a doting aunt, but by a woman named Bahia, a servant who'd tended the Otto household for years. She was tall, her skin a deep ebony that glistened with sweat, her hands calloused from scrubbing floors and shucking oysters. The Ottos, Thomas, a stern man with a mustache like wire, and Margaret, a frail woman whose nerves frayed with every tropical gale, had dismissed her that morning, their voices sharp with accusations of theft. A silver spoon had gone missing, though it later turned up beneath a chair, tarnished and bent. Bahia left without a word, her lips pressed thin, but she returned at dusk, her shadow stretching long across the porch as she handed young Eugene a package wrapped in burlap. "For you," she said, her voice low, like the rumble of thunder over the horizon. Then she was gone, swallowed by the twilight haze. Eugene tore into the burlap with small, eager hands, revealing a doll, 3 feet tall, dressed in a sailor suit of white cotton stained yellow at the edges, its face a burlap sack stitched with black thread for a mouth and 2 mismatched buttons for eyes, one blue, one green. Its body was stuffed with straw, the kind that scratched and rustled when squeezed, and its straw hair poked out in clumps beneath a tiny cap. Eugene hugged it tight, the straw jabbing his arms, and named it Robert after himself, a twin born of cloth and spite. His parents watched, uneasy, as he dragged it upstairs to his room, the doll's legs scraping the steps with a sound like dry leaves dragged by the wind. They didn't notice the faint smell that trailed it, a whiff of ash and something sour, like meat left too long in the sun. The first night, the house was quiet, save for the groan of the wind against the shutters. Eugene slept with Robert beside him, the doll's button eyes staring at the ceiling, its straw hands limp on the quilt. But by morning, the doll was at the foot of the bed, upright, its head tilted toward Eugene as if it had crawled there in the dark. Margaret found it that way, her breath catching as she adjusted her shawl, and told herself the boy must have moved it in his sleep. Eugene shook his head when she asked, his voice small. "Robert wanted to see me better," he said, and she laughed, though the sound died in her throat when she saw the doll's mismatched eyes glint in the dawn light, one blue, one green, both wet with something she couldn't name. The movements grew bolder after that. A chair toppled in the dining room one night, its legs splintered as if crushed, though no one had been near it. Footsteps echoed from the attic, slow, deliberate thuds that shook dust from the rafters. When Eugene was downstairs, his hands sticky with molasses from breakfast. Margaret found a butcher knife missing from the kitchen, only to discover it later beneath Eugene's bed, its blade crusted with a dark, tacky film that smelled of rust and salt. The air in the house thickened, grew rancid, a stench like wet straw and spoiled milk that clung to the curtains, the rugs, the inside of their lungs. Thomas blamed the heat, the damp, but his voice trembled when he spoke, and he started locking his bedroom door at night, the key rattling in his unsteady grip. Eugene changed too. His wide eyes sank into shadows, his skin paling until it looked like wax stretched over bone. He stopped playing in the yard, stopped chasing the gulls that screeched over the docks. Instead, he sat with Robert, whispering to it in a voice too low to catch, his lips moving as if in prayer. One afternoon, Margaret found him in the parlor, his arm bruised purple from wrist to elbow, the marks shaped like small, clawing fingers. "Robert did it," he said, his voice flat, and when she grabbed the doll to throw it out, Eugene screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the house, until she dropped it, her hands shaking as straw spilled from a split seam in its arm, flecked with something red. The neighbors noticed next. Old Mrs. Curry, who lived across the street in a shack draped with fishing nets, swore she saw the doll in the upstairs window one night, its sailor suit stark against the glass, its head turning to follow her as she shuffled home with her cane. A fisherman named Jed claimed he heard laughter from the Otto house, a high, reedy cackle that cut through the fog, though the family was asleep, their lamps dark. The story spread, whispered over rum at the docks, and soon the Otto home became a shadow on the street, a place where the air felt wrong, where the gulls stopped circling. Years passed, and Eugene grew into a man, tall, thin, with a painter's hands and a gaze that never settled. He married, and a woman with auburn hair and a laugh that faded the longer she lived in that house. Robert stayed, a fixture in the attic now, its straw body sagging, but its eyes still sharp, still watching. The disturbances never stopped, and woke to scratches on her legs, 3 jagged lines that wept blood onto the sheets, the skin around them puckered and gray. She found her cat, a sleek black thing named Shadow, gutted on the porch one morning, its belly split wide, its entrails strung across the steps like garland, flies already swarming the glistening mess. The doll was there too, perched on the railing, its straw hands crusted with blood that dripped onto the wood, slow and thick, pooling in the cracks. Thomas died in 1920, his heart giving out during a storm, his body found slumped in the parlor with 3 scratches carved into his chest, the skin peeled back like petals. Margaret followed a year later, her frail frame wasting away in a sanatorium, her last words a babble about straw and eyes that wouldn't close. Eugene and stayed, childless, the house their prison. The doll ruled now, its presence a weight that bent the walls, cracked the mirrors, and found notes scrawled in Eugene's sketchbooks. He sees me, he hates me, the ink smeared with blood that wasn't his. She tried to leave once, her suitcase packed, but the door wouldn't open, the knob slick with something warm and red. That night, she woke to Eugene standing over her, the butcher knife in his hand, his eyes blank as he whispered, Robert says you can't go. Eugene died in 1974, alone, his body found in the attic beside Robert, his throat slit in 3 parallel lines, the blood soaking into the straw until the doll's sailor suit was black with it, and had fled years before, her mind shattered, her arms scarred with scratches that never healed. The house passed to new hands, a young couple, the Myers, who moved in with their daughter, Lily, a girl of 5 with curls like spun gold. They found Robert in the attic, its straw spilling out, its button eyes glinting in the dark. Lily took to it, dragging it downstairs, its legs scraping the floor with that dry, rustling sound. The cycle began again. The Myers lasted 6 months. Lily woke screaming one night, her arm crushed in her sleep, the bone splintered as if squeezed by a vice, the skin bruised with 3-fingered marks. Her mother, Ellen, found the doll beside her, its straw hand wet with blood, a shard of bone clutched in its fist. The next week, Ellen's face was slashed in the kitchen, 3 cuts from brow to chin, the flesh hanging in strips, blood pooling on the counter as she staggered to the sink, her screams muffled by the buzzing of flies that poured from the doll's mouth. Her husband, Paul, tried to burn it, dousing it with kerosene, but the flames wouldn't catch. The straw smoked, blackened, but held, and the doll's eyes glowed green and blue through the haze, its stitched mouth curling wider. They fled, leaving the doll behind, but the house didn't stay empty. Tourists came, drawn by the whispers, the legend of Robert the doll. A man named Carl stayed one night in 1985, a skeptic with a camera and a smirk. He was found the next morning, his chest carved open, his ribs cracked wide, his heart missing, the floorboards beneath him stained with 3 parallel pools of blood. The doll sat on his bed, its straw hands slick, its sailor suit dripping red. A woman named Sarah touched it in 1992, her fingers brushing its arm, and woke days later to find her daughter's crib empty, the sheets soaked with blood, the child's body in the yard, her throat slit in 3s, a tuft of straw clutched in her tiny fist. Robert remains in Key West, locked in a glass case at the Fort East Martello Museum, its straw body hunched, its mismatched eyes dull until the light shifts. The air around it hums, a faint rustle, like straw shifting in the wind, or something deeper, hungrier, laughing as it waits. Visitors bleed without cause, their skin splitting in 3s, arms, necks, faces, leaving trails of blood that clot on the floor, thick and dark. The scratches follow them home, marking new flesh, new lives. Some say the doll's jealousy has faded, that it's just a story now, a relic for the curious. Others hear the footsteps in their attics, the scrape of straw on wood, and feel the weight of eyes, one blue, one green, watching from the dark. Story 3. Mandy, the Porcelain Plague. The Canal Museum in British Columbia wasn't much to look at. A squat, brick building perched on the edge of a town where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was 1991, a year when the world felt restless, and the museum was a quiet refuge for relics no one else wanted. Rusted tools, faded photographs, a spinning wheel missing half its spokes. But in June, a new donation arrived, one that didn't fit the usual mold of forgotten history. It came in a cardboard box, taped shut, and stained with something brown that flaked off when touched. Inside was Mandy, a porcelain doll with a cracked face, her dress a tattered lace shroud, her glass eyes clouded blue like cataracts. The note pinned to her chest was brief, scrawled in a shaky hand. "Take her. I can't anymore." No name, no explanation, just the doll, her head lolling as if her neck had given up. The donor was a woman from Vancouver, or so the rumors went, a recluse who'd lived alone in a clapboard house on the city's fringes, her windows boarded, her yard overgrown with nettles that stung anyone who came too close. She dropped the box at the museum's doorstep in the dead of night, her footsteps fading into the fog before anyone could ask why. The staff didn't think much of it at first. Dolls were common enough. Creepy, sure, but harmless. Carrie Walsh, the curator, a woman with graying hair and a practical streak, set Mandy on a shelf in the storage room, her cracked face turned to the wall, her dress catching dust. The museum had bigger problems: a leaking roof, a budget stretched thin, a janitor named Pete who drank on the job. Mandy was just another oddity. Until she wasn't. The first sign came a week later. Carrie was alone in the storage room, cataloging a box of arrowheads, when she heard it. A faint sob, high and keening, like a child lost in the dark. It came from the shelf where Mandy sat, her porcelain head still facing the wall, her glass eyes hidden. Carrie froze, her pen hovering over the clipboard, her breath shallow as the sound stretched out, then snapped off like a thread cut with scissors. She turned Mandy around, her hands steady despite the prickle on her neck, and saw nothing but that cracked face, the fissure running from brow to chin like a scar that wouldn't heal. The eyes stared back, blue and dull, but for a moment, they seemed to flicker, a shadow moving behind the glass. Carrie shook it off, blamed the late hour, and locked the room behind her. But the air felt heavier when she left, thick with a smell she couldn't place, something wet and sour, like milk gone bad. The sobs didn't stop. They crept into the museum at odd hours, echoing through the halls when the lights were low, a sound that burrowed into the skull and stayed there. Pete heard them too, stumbling out of the basement one night with his flask half empty, his face pale as he muttered about a girl crying where no girl could be. He found Mandy on the floor that time, her shelf empty, her cracked face tilted up as if she'd fallen or crawled. He shoved her back, his fingers brushing her cold porcelain cheek, and swore he felt it twitch, a shudder that ran up his arm like a current. The next morning, he found a rat in the basement, its belly split open, its guts arranged in a tight spiral around the drain, the blood still wet and glistening. Mandy was on the stairs when he looked up, her glass eyes glinting in the dim light, a smear of red on her cracked chin. The staff started to fray. Carrie's headaches came first, sharp, stabbing pains that pulsed behind her eyes, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. She'd sit at her desk, rubbing her temples, and see flashes in the dark, a woman with no eyes, her sockets weeping blood that ran down her cheeks in thick, clotted streams. The dreams followed, night after night, until Carrie stopped sleeping, her face hollowing out, her hands trembling as she poured coffee she couldn't taste. Pete's hands shook too, but not from drink. Scratches appeared on his arms, 3 parallel lines that wept pus and blood, the skin around them gray and peeling. He found another rat a week later, this one headless, its neck a ragged stump, the blood pooled in a pattern of 3 beneath Mandy's shelf. He quit the next day, his voice cracking as he told Carrie something was wrong, something alive in that doll. The museum opened Mandy to the public in August, a glass case her new home, a plaque reading donated 1991, the only story they could give. Visitors came, drawn by the cracks in her face, the eerie tilt of her head. But they didn't stay long. A woman named Janet, a tourist from Seattle, leaned close to the case one afternoon, her breath fogging the glass, and felt a cold hand on her neck. Fingers that squeezed until her throat bruised, 3 purple marks blooming under her skin. She stumbled out, gasping, her eyes wild as she swore the doll's head turned, its cracked face following her through the glass. A man named Tom, a trucker passing through, laughed at the story and tapped the case with his knuckles. He was dead 3 days later, found in his rig on the border, his chest carved open, his ribs cracked wide, his heart gone, the cab floor stained with 3 pools of blood. The museum's air grew rancid after that, a stench of rot and wet porcelain that clung to the walls, the floors, the inside of your lungs. Flies came, a buzzing swarm that blackened the windows, their bodies bursting against the glass, leaving smears of black and red that dripped like tears. Carrie found a note one morning, scrawled on the back of a visitor log in jagged, red ink. "She sees me." The letters bled into the paper, the edges curling as if burned. She burned it in the sink, the flames licking up the page, but the smell lingered, sulfur and blood, thick enough to choke on. The next night, she woke to footsteps in her apartment, slow and heavy, dragging across the floor. She found nothing but a smear of blood on her bedroom door, 3 lines that dripped onto the carpet, still warm. The terror crossed borders. A collector named Daniel from Portland, Oregon, visited in 1992, drawn by the whispers of Mandy's curse. He bribed a night guard to let him touch her, his fingers tracing the crack in her face, the porcelain cold and slick under his skin. He took a shard that flaked off, a jagged piece the size of a dime, and slipped it into his pocket. That night, his hotel room filled with sobs, a keening wail that shook the walls, the air thick with flies that swarmed from the vents. He woke to scratches on his chest, 3 lines that split deeper with every breath, the blood soaking his shirt until it stuck to his skin. He fled, the shard still in his pocket, and drove south, the sobs following him across state lines. In Tacoma, he stopped at a motel, his hands shaking as he locked the door. The next morning, the maid found him, his throat slit in 3s, his eyes gone, the sockets weeping blood that pooled on the floor, the shard clutched in his fist, stained red. Back at the museum, Mandy's case cracked one night. 3 fissures that spiderwebbed across the glass, the edges sharp and wet with something dark. Carrie found a bird the next day, a sparrow, its wings torn off, its body split in a spiral on the floor beneath the case, the blood still dripping when she touched it. The staff stopped going near her after that, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls, their shadows stretching long and thin. A janitor named Mike, Pete's replacement, lasted a month before he quit, his arms scarred with scratches that wouldn't heal, his dreams filled with a woman whose eyeless face wept blood onto his chest. He swore he saw Mandy move once, her cracked head tilting in the case, her glass eyes glinting red in the dark, a smile curling where no smile should be. The museum locked her away in 1995, a storage room with no windows, the door bolted with steel. But the sobs still leak out, faint and keening, a sound that claws at the walls. Visitors who linger too long bleed without cause. 3 scratches on their arms, their necks, their faces, the skin splitting open, the blood thick and clotting. A girl named Emily, a teenager from Idaho, touched the door in 2001, her fingers brushing the steel, and woke days later to find her brother's crib empty, the sheets soaked red, his body in the yard, his throat slit in 3s, a shard of porcelain in his tiny hand. The air around Mandy hums now, a buzz like flies or a cracked voice, pleading or laughing, it's hard to tell. She sits in the dark, her cracked face turned to the wall, her glass eyes waiting. And so, the glass closes on Mandy, but the shadows don't fade. 3 dolls, Annabelle, Robert, Mandy, 3 vessels of something older, hungrier, than the cloth and straw and porcelain that hold them. They sit now, locked away, their eyes glinting in the dark, their hands still with blood that never dries. But are they contained? Or are they waiting, their malice seeping through the cracks, the cases, the miles between them and you? This is Dolls of the Damned, and if you've made it this far, you've felt it. The cold on your neck, the prickle in your gut, the whisper in the quiet that isn't the wind. These aren't just stories. They're warnings, etched in blood and bone, of what watches when you think you're alone. Look around you now. That shadow in the corner, is it just the light? That creak in the floor, is it just the house settling? Or is it something else, something with glass eyes and a smile that doesn't move? Annabelle's scratches still mark the unwary, 3 lines that weep in the night. Robert's jealousy still claws at the living, his straw hands reaching for what he can't have. And Mandy, her cracked face still weeps, her sobs a plague that shatters minds and spills blood across borders. They're out there, in museums, in attics, in the spaces you don't look. Maybe they're closer than you think. So, tell me, what keeps you awake now? Is it the thought of yarn hair tangled with blood, straw rustling in the dark, porcelain cracking under a weight you can't see? Drop your fears in the comments. Let them spill out like the gore we've waded through tonight. Because here's the truth. These dolls don't sleep. They wait. And every listener, every voice that echoes back, is another thread in their web. You've heard their stories. You felt their gaze. Now, check your doors, your windows, the shadows under your bed. Turn on a light if you dare, but don't be surprised if it flickers, if the air grows thick, if something small and still moves just out of sight. Good night, brave souls. Or what's left of it.